Right, so what are my credentials? Well, this is a shelf in my office. I've got the collected works of Charles Darwin on my shelf. I bought them for £400. I have not read them all. Not read every word he wrote. I've read The Origin of Species. I've read parts of The Voyage of the Beagle, parts of The Descent of Man. But my credentials are that I did actually delve into this subject quite deeply a few years ago in the run-up to the bicentenary in 2009 when I wrote this book, The Rough Guide to Evolution, which you've already heard about. And I guess I learned a lot about Darwin, evolution, and all those things in preparation for that book. So although I'm not a professional evolutionary biologist, nor am I a historian of science, I hope I will be able to inform and perhaps even entertain you during the rest of the talk. And what I want to do is, if you've got a £10 note in your pocket, you'll see this kind of view of Darwin with the big bushy beard, looking very avuncular, almost like a saint, in the kind of hagiography of evolution. They try and make him look like this. And what I want to do is actually point out that he wasn't born that way. He was always born. And in fact, when he was young, he was a bit of a sinner. He was sensuous, silly, and substance abuser. So I'm going to go through some of Darwin's early years as a young man and tell you about the kinds of things he got up to then. Now, I think I should just stay on the right side of not offending anyone. Apologies if I do offend your sensitivities. We will be talking about Darwin's sexuality in places, and other things that he did that were naughty as well. Here's a bad pun. Let's get down and dirty. So just as a quick overview, what do we know about Darwin? Well, he was born in Shrewsbury, studied in Edinburgh, Cambridge, went on the Beagle voyage, returned to live in London, lived in Down House for the rest of his life, for 40 years, did lots of work on geology, zoology, spent an inordinate amount of time studying barnacles, wrote The Voyage of the Beagle, and then read The Origin of Species in 1859 and in 1871. So we can go home now, Darwin. But let's go through now at a slightly slower pace, and we start here in Shrewsbury. Now, there's a quote there from Houseman, from Shropshire Lad. High the veins of Shrewsbury gleam islanded in seven stream, the bridges from the steeple crest across the water east and west. And you can see the whole of Shrewsbury there surrounded by the River Severn. Shrewsbury is an unusual place in the whole world. I'm pretty certain it must be the only place in which you can go into a McDonald's, go downstairs, and you can see a picture of Darwin in a stained glass window. People in the deep south of America would be getting very upset if they could actually come and see that and know about that. So Darwin grew up in Shrewsbury. This little inset there is an original picture from the time, him with his sister. These pictures here are, I guess we call them samizdat in Russian. They are kind of illegally sort of smuggled pictures. There was an exhibition in Wolverhampton Art Gallery just before the Darwin bicentenary year of Soviet art depicting Darwin. And in the Soviet Union, Darwin was a real hero. There was in fact a Darwin museum in Moscow, and there were two artists who were actually commissioned to do work on Darwin. And so this guy here, Yevstafiev, he produced these pictures of Darwin's life. And believe it or not, I just photographed him on my iPhone as I walked along. Here you can see Darwin. He grew up in a place called the Mount, a big house on the outskirts of Shrewsbury. Here he is looking at wildlife as he lives a fairly innocent sort of childhood. Now, Darwin grew up in this kind of mixed environment. His mother was a Unitarian, and he used to go to this Unitarian chapel, which is still there, and you can go and visit it in the middle of Shrewsbury. So Unitarians, rather unusual dissenting form of Protestant Christianity, where they don't believe that Jesus was divine. His father was a pragmatic man. I think it's probably safe to say his father was a non-believer, probably. But he was pragmatic enough to say, well, actually, Darwin should get baptised into the Church of England. So it's where he got baptised, in St Chad's Church in Shrewsbury. And its other main claim to fame is that when they had the Hanging Chads episode, when Bush got elected, their website went incandescent because everyone was Googling Chads and he went to this school when he was very young, his first school, which was run by the Unitarian minister. He then went to Shrewsbury School, which is a famous public school, and the buildings there you can see behind the statue, the original buildings of the school when he went there. The statue was put up in front of that after he died. You go upstairs, this is now actually the library in Shrewsbury. If you go up the stairs in the library, up to the top floor, you can see the classroom where Darwin had his lessons. Pretty dry stuff in those days, lots of classics and so forth. If you look around the classroom, engraven into the wood are lots of graffiti of pupils from yesteryear. Going back into the early 19th century, I did spend half an hour trying to see if I could see Darwin scribbled in anywhere there. I couldn't find any Darwins, but you can find others from the same sort of time. There's one from 1792, from quite a few years before Darwin. It's well worth a visit if you go to Shrewsbury. Here's a quote from Monty Python. He's not the Messiah, he's just a naughty boy. Back then he was a bit of a naughty boy. There was nothing really to mark Darwin out as any kind of child prodigy. And in his autobiography he said, I believe that in many ways I was a naughty boy. He was given to inventing deliberate falsehoods. He gathered fruit from his father's tree, hid them in the shrubbery, and then made out that he discovered this hoard that he'd actually put there himself. Sometimes stole fruit. He beat a puppy once, just for the hell of it, more or less, just for a sense of power. And his father once said, we're not quite sure when his father said this, because it's recorded in Darwin's autobiography many, many decades later. But his father actually really put him down and said, be careful nothing but shooting dogs and rat catching, you'll be a disgrace to yourself and all your family. Darwin's father was a medic, and so it seemed natural that Darwin should actually go into the medical profession as well. In fact, Darwin's great-grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was also a very eminent physician. He went up to Edinburgh to study medicine, but he really didn't take to it at all. And in his autobiography, there's a quote in his autobiography how he watched these botched operations. In those days, there was no anaesthesia, lots of blood and gore, fully conscious children having operations. He really couldn't take to that. He did actually, though, gain some useful education while in Edinburgh. He met this Negro, or black person, as we say now, who lived in Edinburgh, who had been born in South America, I think as a freed slave, and he'd learned he'd made a living as a taxidermist, and he taught Darwin how to stuff animals. And Darwin was very impressed that this guy was a pleasant, intelligent man. This is also one of those Soviet pictures. This is one of those reconstructions of Darwin's previous life. Another person he came across when he was in Edinburgh was this guy, Dr. Grant. He said, I knew him well. He's dry and formal in manner, but much enthusiasm beneath this outer crust. And it was here that he first came face to face with the idea of evolution. Certainly being said by anyone outside his own family. And that he pointed out that maybe this lay the seeds of the later evolutionary ideas he had. He also used to go for these very long walks and go along the sea coast very close to Edinburgh and look at the local wildlife with Dr. Grant. Okay, so things didn't work out in Edinburgh, and it was clear that Darwin wasn't going to be a medic. So it was decided that he'd go and do a degree at Cambridge, with the idea that if you got a degree at Cambridge, you could then perhaps go into the priesthood, become an Anglican priest, as a kind of very nice sort of job for a gentleman to do. He didn't actually go there to study theology per se, he just did an ordinary degree at the University of Cambridge. And a friend of mine, John Van Wy, wrote in the bicentenary year a nice account of Darwin's time in Cambridge, and I'm going to draw on some of that in the next few slides. So, Darwin, when he was there, he studied, did all this dry stuff of classics and Euclid and maths and so forth, but he also went out to the countryside and he engaged in this local craze of collecting the local wildlife, particularly beetles. And this is a little cartoon that one of his contemporaries wrote. It says, go it, Charlie, because he was out there collecting beetles all the time when he was at university. So, in the bicentenary year, actually as a way of getting away from this idea that Darwin was always that guy with the beard and always born at sort of 65, some work was commissioned by Christ College, the college in which Darwin stayed, to actually have this statue produced of Darwin as a young man. So it's one of the few depictions of Darwin as a young man that you'll see in paintings or in sculpture. And in fact, during the bicentenary year, I actually took a tour around the country. Took some people there's a guy doing a rap guide to evolution, and some people come from the Dover trial, which is a famous trial about evolution in the US. And as we drove into Cambridge as part of our tour, we actually saw this being delivered on the back of a lorry. Right? I knew it was coming. I was just really excited to see the statue arrive. But Darwin was still a naughty boy. He was a naughty young man as well. He said, during my 3 years as I spent at Cambridge, my time was wasted as far as academic studies are concerned. And then he says, although there were redeeming features, my time was sadly wasted. This is all from his autobiography. Passion for shooting and hunting and riding. He used to dine together, got in with these dissipated, low-minded young men. We used to dine together in the evening, and these dinners often included men of a higher standard, and we sometimes drank too much. I guess it's not surprising that students get drunk, is it? But it's kind of a bit surprising that it was going on even back then, and even people like Darwin, the guy with the beard, the avuncular guy, he got drunk when he was a student. Jolly singing, playing cards. He said, I ought to feel ashamed of days and evenings I spent. Some of my friends were very pleasant, we were all in the high spirits. I cannot help looking back at these times with much pleasure. Here's from one of his relatives, one of his cousins, named Fox Darwin. He wrote this down. He said that Darwin asked him to go for a long walk in the Thames and to search for some natural. Actually, I'm not sure if this is Fox Darwin. It's one of Darwin's friends. I can't remember who it was now. Darwin. They went out for a walk together. They dined late in the evening, and as soon as dinner was over, they're dining in Darwin's rooms in Cambridge. They fell into their easy chairs and fell sound asleep. Now, your average person doesn't just fall asleep in an armchair, not when they're young like that. Young people want to stay up all night. So we have to read in what actually happened here. So they got pissed out their heads, drank far too much wine, and then fell into a drunken stupor, I think is the way we should interpret this. And then this guy woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and realised that he was outside of his own college, and the rules were that you had to be in your college after a certain time, and rushed back to get there. And I think luckily he did get back to his college and not get into trouble. But there we are. There's some preliminary evidence that Darwin was a bit of a drunkard as a young man. Now this is something that John Van Wy turned up. This is another little sketch by one of Darwin's friends and contemporaries. And if we look carefully at this, we can see it's a case study in substance abuse. So, if you look here, we've got cigars, we've got some meerschaum pipes, cross tobacco pipes, a wine barrel, and some beer tankards. inscription on it in Latin. It says, Albert Way of Trinity College, a more smoke-filled friend, gives, devotes and dedicates this to his best friend Charles Darwin. So this is the kind of image that Darwin was putting forward to his friends, of someone who smoked too much and drank too much as a young man at the University of Cambridge. Okay, so his time at Cambridge was coming to an end. He had plans to go and see the world. One of his friends died suddenly, and some of the original plans they had were put to one side. But then he got invited to go on to this voyage of the Beagle. And that was the making of him, if you like. That actually set in motion the thinking and the evidence that went into his theory of evolution later on. He was invited onto the Beagle because this guy, Robert Fitzroy, Fitzroy wanted to have a gentleman companion. It was very much a class-ridden society, so the guys actually running the ship were not considered suitable companions. He wanted to have someone from the gentleman class to travel with him. The reason he wanted that was twofold. One was that the previous captain of the Beagle had a guy called Pringle Stokes, had committed suicide down in Tierra del Fuego on the previous voyage of the Beagle. So it's a miserable place, Tierra del Fuego, and you go the wrong time of year, and it's just miserable weather. And the guy just came unhinged and he shot himself in the head. Well, he locked himself in his room on the boat and then shot himself in the head. Didn't manage to kill himself and took him 9 days to die. It's a slow, horrible death. So Fitzroy was mindful of that. He was also mindful of the fact that his uncle, Lord Castlereagh, actually had also committed suicide. So Castlereagh, you may have heard from history books, was involved in that period after the Napoleonic Wars, the Congress period or whatever, sort of setting out the new map of Europe. A few years after that, though, there was some whiff of some kind of gay scandal that Castlereagh was involved in, and he went and slit his own throat. And so Fitzroy, and also I think Fitzroy knew himself that he had a kind of temperament that was predisposed to such things. In fact, to cut a long story short, Fitzroy himself slit his own throat, but that was many decades later. So Fitzroy took Darwin with him, and as a result of that, Darwin went off around the world. A lot of the time, the boat was actually travelling around South America. They spent probably about a third of the time of the voyage of the Beagle, in quotes, was actually spent on land rather than on the boat for Darwin. And then they went around the world, circumnavigated with the Galapagos, ET, New Zealand, Australia, which is Cape Town, and then popped back into Brazil and then back home again. So 5 years away from home on the voyage of the Beagle. And he saw all sorts of marvellous things. I mean, reading the voyage of the Beagle, you can just see the kind of excitement of the journey. Here's where he's describing being out in the Roman Ocean. As soon as we entered the estuary of the Plata, the weather was very unsettled, surrounded by seals and penguins. Witnessed a splendid scene of natural fireworks. The masthead and yardarm shone with St. Elmo's light, and the hills of rain seemed almost traced as if they'd been rubbed with phosphorus. And the sea was so luminous that the tracks of penguins were marked by a fiery wake, and the darkness of the sky was momentarily illuminated by the most vivid lightning. So, this is the adventure of a lifetime, really. This is like Indiana Jones cast back 150 years. He also witnessed on ground the tremendous calamity of the shaking earth, of earthquakes. On the west coast of South America, he experienced earthquakes there. To point out here, a bad earthquake, it once destroys the oldest associations. This idea of the earth as emblem of solidity. 1 second of time created in the mind a strange idea of insecurity, which ours reflection has not produced. And it just goes here, very severe earthquake. It's a humiliating thing to see the works which have cost man so much time and labour overthrown in 1 minute. He also, during that voyage, did made lots of interesting observations in the field of natural history. And he actually opens the origin of species with this sentence here that went on board Beagle's Naturals. I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of inhabitants of South America and geological relation of the present to the past and how it was about continent. And a couple of things particularly struck him was that he found the fossil remains of extinct animals, giant sloths, for example, and he realised that these were actually, though they were distinctive in that they were much bigger than existing sloths, they were the same kind of family and that they weren't found anywhere else in the world. So he could see that there was a relationship between extinct forms that were there and the existing forms. He also noticed there were these South American ostriches, so-called rheas, and he realised that there are actually two species of rhea, one in a more northerly region than another, but they were very closely related, but they were distinct species. And so these kind of observations started seeding into his mind the idea that maybe species changed over time. If you go to the kind of popular cartoon version, it's all about going to the Galapagos and seeing the finches. That's actually rubbish. I mean, he doesn't mention the finches until you get to page 400 or something in the Origin of Species. This is what he starts with, it's these kind of things that he saw. The other thing that struck him on the voyage of the Beagle was just the varieties of humankind that we came across. He was, as part of his family, he was actually heir to a tradition that abhorred slavery, which are Darwin's, even his grandfather Erasmus Darwin, this famous physician, wrote poetry as well as practicing as a medic. He wrote this very grand epic poetry and castigated the British government for allowing slavery back in the late 18th century. And this particular symbol here, also, Am I Not a Man and a Brother, part of the emancipation movement. His other grandfather, Wedgwood, actually had a cameo made of that when he examined Darwin's together against slavery. So Darwin was quite shocked when he saw slavery in action in Brazil, really in his face, in a way which he hadn't actually seen up till then. Slaves in England had already, slavery in England had been abolished already. He was also much struck when he saw the inhabitants of Tierra del Fuego, because these individuals were living in a very destitute fashion. They were, as far as he was concerned, they were kind of the lowest form of humanity that you come across. That they were just, they weren't hunting, they weren't farming, they were just foraging on the seashore, just knocking limpets off and eating them. Really quite a miserable existence. He also was party to, witnessed an ongoing genocide, if you like. I think that's probably safe to use that term. In South America, the gauchos, as they were called, these were kind of Hispanic South American cowboys destroying the local Native American population. And Darwin actually rode with these gauchos. Here's a couple more pictures from that Soviet artist there, trying to reconstruct Darwin's time on the pampas of South America, travelling with the gauchos. And Darwin made some observations. One bit where he was travelling with these people, and they all got drunk together. These guys, not Darwin, but the guys he was with. And it says that some drank till they were intoxicated, others swallowed the steaming blood of the cattle slaughtered for their suppers, and then being sick from drunkenness, they cast it up again and were smeared with filth and gore. It's pretty gross stuff. But the interesting thing is that Darwin obviously was still a civilized man, because at the time he saw this, he then starts quoting in Latin the Aeneid. So although he says he wasted all his time in his studies, he obviously knew enough of Virgil to actually be able to quote in Latin this quotation about the Cyclops eating his children as a similar kind of thing. Darwin on Tahiti, well, he was much struck there by the sort of sensuality of the place. Like Gauguin, who did this painting a few decades later, he pointed out at the end of this quote here, you can see, he says, this is very, it's almost kind of homoerotic the way he said this. A white man bathing by the side of the Tahitians like a plant bleached by the gardener's art, compared dark green one growing vigorously in the fields. You know, he was obviously looking at these people and looking at the shape of them with a keen eye. But of course, he was also looking at the women, and he made comments about South American women when he was writing The Voyage of the Beagle. Our female companion was rather good looking, belonged to one of the most respectable families in Castro. There was a time when he was at dinner, and the captain said, one question to ask me, much like the trembled to think how deeply scientific it would be, but in fact the question was whether the ladies of Buenos Aires were not the handsomest in the world. He replied, they get charming, so. And then when he was in Lima, he couldn't keep his eyes off the ladies as well. Seen by the ladies, like mermaids could not keep eyes away from them. So Darwin returned from the voyage of the Beagle and settled into life in London for a short time. And then started to think to himself, well, should he get married? It's that time of man's life where he starts to settle down. Now Darwin being Darwin, you know, it wasn't a simple thing, just falling in love with someone. He actually had to weigh up the pros and cons of getting married. And you can't actually read this. It says at the top there, this is the question. On the one side you've got marry, on the other side you've got not marry. He's weighing up the arguments for and against. For the marry side, it says children, if please God, constant companion, friend in old age, feel interested in one object to be beloved and played with. Here's where he really thinks of women. Better than a dog, anyhow. You know, a wife. Wife's a bit more of a companion than a dog. Not much more, but maybe a bit more of a companion than a dog. Charms of music, female chit-chat, things good for one's health. Then you can see terrible loss of time, tolerable. And then over on this side, that's one of his not married reasons. Over here, no children, no second life, no one to care for one in old age. What's the use of working without sympathy, freedom? Then he's saying, but there's some good things about being a bachelor. Freedom to go where you like, choice of society, contact with clever men, not forced to visit relatives, and to bend in every trifle. Now, how many men kind of feel that way about married life? Loss of time, expense and anxiety of children, perhaps quarrelling, not reading in the evening, fatness and idleness. I mean, that's a kind of end state for many a man when they get married. Anxiety and responsibility, less money for books, and so on and so forth. And then you can see on both sides he said, intolerable thing working. Imagine living all one's life solitary in smoky, dirty London. Only picture yourself a nice soft wife on a sofa with good fire and books and music perhaps. Compare this vision with the dingy reality of Great Malvern where he's currently staying. And so he decides in the end that the decision is marry, QED. Now, when he returned to London, his mind was in a kind of ferment, if you like. He was thinking about all the things he'd seen. He was just ranging over the whole range of human endeavour and intellectual pursuits. And he kept these notebooks, a series of leather-bound notebooks. Again, one of these little Russian pictures of him with his wife, then Emma, his cousin. And he scribbled in these things. He never expected anyone else to read them. They were for his own benefit. But luckily, posterity has actually preserved them. So here, in Notebook B, we see all sorts of interesting thoughts here. He started to think about evolution. One species changes. Does it progress? A key point about Darwin's thinking, he was clear in his mind that evolution wasn't always about things getting better, getting more perfect. So to talk about animals, one animal being higher than another, higher orders, the law of adaptation leads you to think the world is older than geologists think. So you can see there's all these very subversive thoughts going on in there. And in Notebook B, we see the first real glimpse of one of Darwin's great ideas, this idea of the tree of life, of unity of common descent. And he scribbles, tree of life should be called perhaps a coral of life, base of branch of dead, so the passage cannot be seen. And he sketches in this little sketch here with the dotted lines showing the extinct things and then the extant species at the top there as the branches. A little bit later he shows something a bit more bushy, same kind of idea, that the dotted lines showing the extinct things. And in fact, In modern biology, we actually see this tree of life now across the whole of all living organisms. There's a guy, Carl Woese, who brought a kind of revolution in our thinking in the 1980s and divided life into three main branches: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. And in fact, if you look carefully, you can see, if you use this special microscope that allows you to see invisible ink, you can see that actually Darwin did get there back in the 1830s and got there long before Woese, because you've got the same, exactly the same branch in here, these three different branches seen in Darwin's work. But of course, the most iconic depiction of the tree of life came a few pages later. In a sense, it's Darwin's iconic cogito, where he writes, "I think," and instead of writing in longhand loads of sentences, he draws a picture. He draws a figure diagram, and this is the diagram that he draws here, with this one at the bottom there, and then these different branches, and this kind of bushy branching, which is typical of the way in which we see evolution now after Darwin. And this has become so iconic that you'll see it replicated all around the world. And some people, I mean, there are some people so geeky that they even see their bodies as somewhere where you should celebrate this stuff. Here's a guy who's had this tattooed onto his flank. There's a guy, Carl Zimmer, in the US, who collects scientific tattoos, pictures of scientific tattoos. There's one of them there. He goes on, he makes this point about monkeys and men, monkeys and angels. He really has a grasshopper mind. He's going all over the place in this book. These are some of the things that he kind of speculates on: body odor, slavery, animal liberation, mixed marriages, incest, why do we have male nipples, rudimentary bones, pigs, gates, mammalian mass extinctions, floating trees. His mind is just everywhere. But just occasionally he comes out with things that are really quite inspiring. He's talking here about animals. He says, if we allow conjecture to run wild, then animals, our fellow brethren in pain, disease, death and suffering and famine, our slaves in the most laborious works, our companions in our amusements, they may partake from our origin in one common ancestor, we may all be netted together. And so in this you can see the beginnings of a modern animal liberation movement, vegetarianism, it's almost a flavour of Buddhism in this kind of view of the oneness of life here. He also speculates about slavery, and he points out that basically slavery is demeaning to the slave owner as well as to the slave. And he points out that the white man debased his nature by doing this, and that we should soar above such prejudices to exalt the nature of man. Now, just a few naughty slides coming up now. So Darwin also says some quite dirty things in there. He speculates about female genital organs. Some of these things in monkeys quite wonderfully produced. And there's no whole bar here. He's pointing out that women have this instinctive desire, which is perhaps more definite than with the bitch. He seems to have this, he's kind of, in a sense, he's anticipating rap music and hip-hop by comparing women to bitches. A bit like comparing his wife to a dog. So, he's not a politically correct individual in this. But he says, these facts may be turned to ridicule, may be thought disgusting, but to a philosophic naturalist, pregnant with interest. So that's it. As a scientist, you're allowed to think what you like, even if it's a bit distasteful. And then in that last one there, he's basically comparing the growth of women's breasts during the development of the female to the change from a caterpillar to a butterfly, which is, I know, it's quite a nice metaphor, I suppose. But again, it's slightly geeky, and he's clearly thinking like a man. In the M&N notebooks, these so-called metaphysical notebooks, he speculates more widely, not just on things to do with natural history, biology, and so forth. And I can't go through all of them here, but they're all just listed there. But he points out, if you go from ancient Greece to the Dark Ages, you see not progression but decline. He says in his theory, there's no absolute tendency to progression. He mentions he read a bit of one of Dickens's columns in a newspaper that cured his headache. he kind of anticipates Freud here. So the possibility of the brain having whole trains of thought, feeling, and perception separate from the ordinary state of mind. So you may have heard of Chomsky. So Chomsky has this idea that we're born with this language acquisition device that means that we can learn language as an instinct very easily. But Darwin was there first. It requires far higher and far more complicated instinct to learn Greek than to have it handed down as an instinct. And he also belittles the human intellect. And this is a recurrent theme of Darwin's, actually, that, you know, as an evolved thing, the human intellect is kind of fallible. And it is more fitted to recognise one construction of beauty in the universe. Now it starts getting even dirtier. He goes on about this student who, when drunk, thought everyone was calling him a bastard. He speculates on the case of a man from Shrewsbury who tried to have sex with a turkey. Here he goes on about dogs smelling each other's bottoms. I mean, I guess we've all seen that and thought how disgusting. He writes it down. Again, this, you know, his mind is just goes anywhere. Parallels between stallions licking others and mares, and men's interest in women's breasts. Links between salivation and sex. He's perhaps telling him a little bit about self-abuse here, but we won't dwell on that. And then he goes on about a man who shivers from fear, sublimity, sexual armour, cries from grief, joy, and sublimity. But it gets even dirtier. This is the low point, really. He actually points this, it says here, we should not feel so much surprise at male animals smelling vaginas of females. When it is recollected that the smell of one's own pud, pud stands for pudendum, so he's talking about his own sexual organs, not disagreeable. So how does he know that? I mean, you know, one's mind is full of the idea of him doing some kind of gymnastics to smell himself, or scratching himself and then smelling his fingers. Either way, it's not a very savoury image, and it's quite separate from that image of Darwin as this avuncular man with a beard who was a saint. You know, when he was young, he was just as kind of gross as many other young men. But then he settles down. He does settle into this life, domesticated life, lives at Down House for the next 40 years, and he starts to work on writing up all of the things he'd seen on the Beagle voyage. So he wrote about the geology, he wrote about the natural history, the botany, and everything that he saw. He did actually write, during that time, a little sketch, a pencil sketch, which outlined his theory of evolution, and he actually hid it in a cupboard. I saw the cupboard actually a few weeks ago. I went round to Adam Kane, Darwin's great-great-grandson. This little sketch was put there, and he told his wife that if he should die for some reason, then she should get the sketch published. But he kind of left it to one side. Now, many people say, well, that's because he was so scared of his ideas and so scared of the problems that he would face that he just hid them. John Van Wy has actually written an interesting counter-argument. Mind the Gap, where he points out, well, actually, Darwin didn't get round to writing up evolution for many years because he had so much other work to do. And he wasn't the kind of person who was going to put out stuff until it was actually finished. And so he worked on the Beagle stuff, and that took him several years to get all that done. Then he worked on barnacles for several years, and he got sucked into that field and actually wrote the preeminent work on barnacles. And then only in the 1850s did he actually say, right, now is the time to write up the species work. He was also working on some of the ideas, fine-tuning them as he went along. But, the idea that he was scared and cowering away from things is certainly to be challenged. And if you're interested, you should go and read that book there. But that's a paper by John Van Wy. So Darwin came up with this theory of evolution. I'm almost finished now for this talk. Lots of things fed into it. And I talk of this length, I can't really go into a great deal of detail about all of these things here. We've got this family tradition, we've got Newton in the background. Newton came up with this idea for a law-governed universe, the planets, gravity working in a law-governed way. Geologists coming up with the idea of uniformitarianism, that the present would keep the past, that explain the look of the world by looking at current processes. His Beagle Voyage is linked with Scotland and the Enlightenment there, and if you look in your pocket, on the £10 note you see Darwin, on the £20 note you see Adam Smith, who came up with the idea of the invisible hand, so that markets find the right price for things, not because of someone rationally defining what the price is, because of this invisible hand. I have to point out, just as an Englishman, that it's an absolute scandal that they put a Scotsman on the Bank of England £20 note, and they took Elgar. But that's just the side. He read this guy Malthus, and Malthus had written an essay on population, which he pointed out that populations will inevitably grow. Human populations will double every generation in size, whereas the means to sustain them nowhere near keeps up with that. And Malthus's view was that that means in the end there'd be war or famine or disease. And that fed into Darwin's ideas. The thing was that he was munching along quite happily, and then this letter from Wallace came. I'll say more about that in a moment. Just to also point out that there wasn't just one idea in Darwin's theory of evolution. You think about Darwin and evolution as one thing, a lot of things, and the second lecture will go into some of those in more detail. So what happened was that he was working away, trying to produce a big book on evolution. And then in 1858, a letter arrived from Wallace with a brief essay that Wallace had written on exactly the same subject that Darwin was working on. And this is a letter he wrote to his friend Lyle, pointing out that this had happened. He said, "I never saw such a striking coincidence. If Wallace had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, that's the one he hid under the stairs, he could not have made a better short abstract. Even his terms now stand as the heads of my chapters." So what he didn't know what to do. He thought, well, as an honourable person, Wallace had sent him this essay, many of the same ideas. He'd been working on this for many, many years. So he kind of had priority. He was a gentleman as well. Wallace was, he was a bit from a different class. But so what Darwin did was he sought advice from his friend Lyle. And two of his friends, Lyle and Hooker, came up with the idea that what they would do is actually have both Darwin's ideas and Wallace's ideas communicated together at the same time. So they said these two gentlemen, having independently and unknown to each other, to one another, conceived the very same ingenious theory, they both fairly claim the merit of being original thinkers in this important line of inquiry. And so at the Linnaean Society, there was a reading of some of Darwin's work, his original, some of the stuff in his pencil sketch and some letters and other things he'd written, and then Wallace's essay as well. And nobody really noticed. They said, "Oh, this is not." Nobody noticed this is world-shattering or anything like that. It was not really much past in the annals of life, like the history of life. But as a result of that, Lyle and Hooker said, Darwin, get on with it now. Get on and write that book, and you won't be able to write some long rambling thing. Just get down an abstract of it. And as he wrote here, he actually started working on it. It cost him 13 months and 10 days hard labour. Published under the title of The Origin of Species in November 1859. And there's no doubt the chief work of his life. Here it is. Published by John Murray in London on The Origin of Species on November 24th, 1859. And if you can get hold of one of these first editions, it's worth an awful lot of money now. It's now quite hard to come by. The reception of The Origin of Species was mixed. Some people some of his friends really enjoyed it. Here's a letter from Charles Lyle. He read it, saying that he was really pleased that he persuaded Darwin to actually write it up. And it was a splendid case of close reasoning and long, substantial argument throughout so many pages. It's actually worth looking at The Origin of Species. It is still an accessible volume to read. You wouldn't be able to read what Newton wrote, Principia, but the Origin of Species you can still read. Okay, parts of it are a bit hard-going and a bit turgid, but if you're a good speed reader, you can find the best bits. And in fact, Penguin have produced a little thing called On Natural Selection, about 40 pages, 50-page book, which is worth reading if you can't bear to read the whole thing. But here's just some of Darwin's language. He's describing the idea of natural selection. He says, I call this principle by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved by the term natural selection in order to mark its relation to man's power of selection. We've certainly seen that man, by selection, can certainly produce great results and can adapt organic beings to his own uses through the accumulation of slight but useful variations given to the hand of nature. Then he starts to really wax lyrical. But natural selection, as we shall hereafter see, is a power incessantly ready for action, and is immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts as the works of nature are to those of art. Here's a passage from chapter 5 where he introduces the idea of the tree of life. And he says, the affinity of all the beings of the same class is sometimes being represented by a great tree. I believe this simile largely speaks the truth. As buds give rise by growth of fresh buds, and these a vigorous branch out and overtop on all sides many a feebler branch, so by generation, I believe, it has been the great tree of life, which fills with its dead and broken branches the crust of the earth, and covers the surface with ever-branching and beautiful ramifications. I like this prose. Maybe it's an acquired taste, but there are times where Darwin does soar with the eagles in his prose. There wasn't actually just one origin of species. There were 6 editions in Darwin's lifetime, and he made substantial changes to the work. I think by the time he got to the 6th edition, about a third of the text had changed. And one of my former colleagues, Pallen, actually produced a digital variorum of the Origin of Species, basically looking at it as a kind of form of evolution, if you like, at the way in which it diversified over time, with modification from one edition to the next. And what she noticed was that there was what she considered a defining moment, that Darwin realised that in his own lifetime, he'd actually won the argument, because he changed the way he wrote. So in 1861 and 1866, he says the great majority of naturalists believe that species are immutable productions, not being separately created. But by 1869 and in 1872, until recently, the great majority of naturalists believe. So the tipping point had come, and in his own life, he'd actually seen his ideas receive some acceptance by the majority of naturalists. What was he really like? Well, I just grabbed this out of the book, and I know you can't read it on the screen, but he actually was an engaging individual. He stammered, he had a bit of a speech defect, you couldn't say that, like Jonathan Ross, he couldn't say his R's properly. He was tall, he had blue-grey eyes, he was very thin all through his life. His father and his grandfather were obesely fat. I mean, Erasmus Darwin was so fat that he had to have a semicircle cut out of his writing table to accommodate his girth. But Darwin actually stayed pretty slim all through his life. He liked his children, played billiards with them. There's a little bit of a story when he came back from the Beagle. He liked dogs, and his dog actually recognised him, a bit like the story in the Odyssey, if you read the Odyssey, where the dog is the only thing that recognises Odysseus as he comes back. Same with Darwin. The dog recognised him, picked up where they left off 5 years before as if nothing had happened. He even in later adult life, he liked snuff, and he smoked cigarettes, so his substance abuse didn't go away, but he did actually drink rather less in his home life. He was supposed to be a nice host, unpretentious, given to laughing, and he actually wandered around this area called the Sand Walk, which you can see still at Down House, where you could actually go and do some thinking as he took the exercise there. He used to play backgammon with his wife, and you can actually go to Down House, you can see the backgammon set, and you can see the score sheets, see who's been winning over time. Darwin or his wife were really And he said that he didn't actually read always earnest stuff. He sometimes read trashy novels as well, and particularly like novels where there's a happy ending, pretty women and a happy ending. So Darwin died on April 19th, 1882. He had expected to be buried in Down, in the village of Down, which is in Kent, about 15 miles from London. To this day, actually, it's in green beltland, and it's still fairly unspoilt and rural. Many of his family members are actually buried in the churchyard there. But in the week following his death, there was this groundswell of opinion fanned by the newspapers, and this led to a state funeral in Westminster Abbey instead. And so Hawthorne Hearst collected his body from Down and took all day to go from there up to Westminster. And then on noon on 26th, the funeral began. There were 9 pallbearers. Many of them were Darwin's friends and associates, Huxley, Hooker, Wallace. Interestingly, given the current issue that there seems to be over the Atlantic with evolution in America, one of Darwin's pallbearers back then was the American ambassador to Britain, James Russell Lowell. And they carried Darwin to his final resting place, which is just a few yards from the grave of Isaac Newton. And a week later, a picture in the Times stated his work and character of minds from all countries, classes, creeds, and occupations. So, that naughty boy from Shrewsbury, in the words of the Cornwall Gazette, become the greatest Englishman since Newton. And here's his grave as it is now in Westminster Abbey. And that's me finished for this talk. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions, yeah.
Do you have any questions?